Minister, thanks very much for joining me on the couch.
Great pleasure.
As you mentioned in your speech, of course, Productivity Commission, Royal Commission, a lot of commissions going on in our sector. The Productivity Commission, the key recommendation was to decouple default superannuation from the industrial relations system. Is that the thing that you think will be a game changer? And what will the government take forward from the Productivity Commission?
Well, that's a rather leading question, Sally, but let me say this. I think what's absolutely clear from the Productivity Commission's report is that the system right now isn't working for millions of Australians. It's been broken for millions of Australians, where we have seen their accounts eroded by high premiums that they don't want or don't need for insurance, where we have seen high fees charged, whether they be administration or investment fees, and that's particularly harsh on people who've got low balance accounts, and that's so many Australians, because of course we've got so many Australians with multiple accounts, something again that the Productivity Commission called out. So we've already got legislation in the Parliament to deal with a number of these issues, to deal with transparency and governance, all issues that we're committed to in giving the regulator greater powers. But you're absolutely right, the Productivity Commission said that the industrial relations system is not the right system to determine default superannuation. We need a much better system that will work for members, that will mean that members can be confident that their savings will grow and their savings will be there when they ultimately retire, which is certainly not the case right now. So we're fixing the structural issues. Default super is the next one on the list.
Yeah, and I know it's been quite hard to get some of these measures, particularly reforming superannuation, through the Senate.
Yes.
Are you looking forward to the spring session of Parliament, where you might get a bit more traction with some of these?
Yeah, well, certainly
reforms?
I think now there's a much greater focus on just the practical impact that these reforms will have for individuals. Reuniting people with their own money is very powerful. Making sure that people are not going to be ripped off anymore by high insurance premiums or fees and charges that they shouldn't pay.
Or employers not paying.
Correct, and making sure as well that we give people choice around their superannuation arrangements, because we recognise that superannuation doesn't belong to employers or unions or government or anyone other than the member themselves. And we've got changes in the Parliament right now, in the Senate right now, that would mean around 1 million Australians get to choose their own super, because, as you know, under enterprise bargaining agreements, under that industrial relations framework and workplace determinations, many people can't. And it's simply not right.
Yeah. Do you get a sense that you've been talking about this now for a number of years?
Yes.
We have. Do you get a sense that people, ordinary Australians, are now starting to take notice of super and realise? I walked into a newsroom the other day and one of the journalists there had 8 super funds, and it was only because of the Productivity Commission and I guess the news about super that she counted up and realised how much.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you talk about a journalist. I had another journalist who I spoke to, a bloke who I actually referenced in my speech to the Parliament, who had 7. And, these are people who are well-informed, educated, who until now haven't really recognised that this is their money and that they need to take control of it, and that the system hasn't really been looking after their best interests. And that's why we've made structural changes to the system. And that is what we will continue to pursue. And as you say, I've been like a broken record on this since I've been Minister, because I think it's a really important area. Because we force people to take out superannuation. We force 9.5% at least of their wages to be deferred for their retirement income. And there is a high duty on government to make sure that that money is properly protected. But I think it's cut through when you see stories being run on a current affair, as we've seen only in the last week. And that people are really alive to these issues when I receive multiple hundreds and hundreds of emails from people about their own personal circumstances or the circumstances of their children or their grandchildren.
As you say, it's only taken 25 years, so it's pretty amazing. If you, I want to take you to the Royal Commission in a moment and trust, and I think it'd be good to end on that, because you talked about reflect and reform. where does regulate sit in there? Because we've got a lot of regulation, we've got a lot of rules, we've got a lot of scrutiny. I think people in our sector are definitely reflecting and reforming. And we've been through a lot of reform with advice and life insurance and now superannuation. Where do you see the role of regulation in that, and how do you think that will help Australians regain and strengthen their trust in financial services?
So I think for a lot of governments, regulating for the sake of regulating has been a default response, and I think considered governments shouldn't immediately leap to that. The first thing you should look at is what are the outcomes that you're actually trying to deliver, and you need to think carefully about how you can achieve that. And regulation isn't always the answer in those circumstances. I mean, we saw in the US, for instance, Sarbanes-Oxley, which was very much a ticker box approach. We had the global financial crisis and we had the collapse of a number of very, very big corporates. That wasn't the solution in those circumstances, where we've had a much more principles-based approach to our corporate regulation here in Australia, and for the most part that has served us well. So I think, one, we need to look at it really holistically, and the reflections of the independent Royal Commissioner will be very important in that. Two, I think we need to look at what role each of us has to play. It's not simply the government itself providing the solutions here. Business has a role to play. Stakeholders on the whole have a role to play in terms of the culture that's created in the industry, and regulators themselves have a role to play. I mean, there are regulators with very significant powers already, and the question is, have they always been using the powers that they have at their disposal, and have they been triaging complaints in the way that they should? Now, these are all questions I'm sure that the Royal Commission will reflect upon, and I think before we rush to failure, we need to consider very carefully what the next steps are. And at the heart of it should be the protection of the consumer at the end of the day, because that's what the industry is built around. That's who the government is there to serve. The consumer, the individual, should be at the heart of our considerations.
Minister, thank you very much.
Great pleasure, Sally.
Thank you.